Landon Burroughs had never imagined he would spend his later years standing guard over the very soil his grandfather once tilled with pride. The land wasn't just property, it was legacy, responsibility, and memory, pressed into the uneven surface of every field and every nail of the weather-worn barn. 60 acres of rolling, partially wooded terrain hugged the edge of a conservation border, a place once overlooked by city planners and developers alike, but now a gleaming target for those seeking to revitalize forgotten counties with luxury, communities, commercial trails, and multi-use infrastructure. In his youth, Landon would have laughed off such ambitions, let them build their glass-fronted dreamscapes somewhere else. But as the years passed, so did the quiet, and the silence he once cherished had grown thick with tension. He wasn't a recluse, nor was he interested in romanticizing hardship. He'd spent 30 years working logistics for regional rail companies, mostly invisible to the world, managing things that mattered only when they failed. Bridge inspections, freight manifests, depot schedules. Precision, foresight, and risk assessment were his trade, and when he finally retired, he had no desire to chase beaches or condos. Instead, he returned to the land he inherited, not to play farmer or hermit, but to restore something that had always made sense to him: routine, order, and purpose. The house was modest, unadorned, and stone-built, perched on a low rise like a tired sentinel. Surrounding it were the remnants of a functioning homestead: a weathered barn whose frame still held firm against high winds, a series of small outbuildings now repurposed as tool sheds and storage, and a vast open field that sloped gently downward into a tree-lined boundary. Solar panels lined the southern roof. Rain barrels collected runoff with near-military discipline. A 2-year process of deep well drilling and filtration had freed him from municipal water dependency. No internet beyond a satellite dish, no smart meters, no digital assistants. Landon had deliberately pared life down to what mattered. For nearly a decade, the farm had served as a quiet base of operations for his routines: seasonal vegetable plots, a passive greenhouse, occasional rented grazing rights to local sheep farmers, and, most critically, a self-built range for private. Firearms training, a personal project he kept fully compliant with state regulations. Not because he feared invaders or imagined threats from afar, but because he understood systems, and systems fail. Infrastructure fails. Civil planning fails. And when it does, those unprepared are the first to suffer. Still, he kept to himself. His interactions with local authorities were sparse and polite. He paid taxes early, maintained property lines with almost obsessive clarity, and even hosted 2 county compliance inspections without incident. His presence in the community was ghost-like. No complaints, no violations, no involvement in local politics or school boards. Landon didn't crave friction. But friction, as he was about to learn, doesn't always wait to be invited. The first letter arrived not as a certified envelope or a stamped demand, but as a glossy, well-designed pamphlet tucked inside his mailbox alongside advertisements and bulk print detritus. Its front bore a pastoral image of tomorrow's countryside, with bike paths and scenic cafes overlaying the terrain he knew like the back of his hand. Inside, it detailed the county's proposed Sustainable Development Zoning Initiative, with cheerful maps and bolded slogans like Unlocking the Land, For Everyone, and Shared Prosperity Through Revitalization. In small print at the bottom: Target, Phase 1-South Quadrant, Parcel Group 19B. Landon's address was unmistakably nestled in that quadrant. At first, he dismissed it. Promotional garbage likely sent out in bulk, meant to test reactions. But within days, more literature arrived, this time marked with the seal of the Regional Development Office. Not demands, not threats, but language crafted to imply inevitability. Evaluation. Public good. Potential site of interest. all framed in optimism, as though paving roads and inserting public access trails through private farmland was somehow a gift rather than an intrusion. Landon's eyebrows didn't rise until he received the third letter, this one from the tax assessment office. It stated that his property zoning category had been flagged for provisional review. No action required, it claimed. Just procedural housekeeping. A courtesy notice. But Landon had written notices like these for 30 years. He knew what they meant. The language had changed because the process had begun. The gears had already started turning, and the time to react wasn't next month. It was yesterday. He scheduled an appointment with the county land assessor, arriving in person rather than calling. The clerk, a woman barely in her 30s, greeted him with politeness bordering on pity, and after scanning his parcel ID, she shifted uncomfortably. "There's been no final decision, Mr. Burrows," she said, emphasizing the word final like a disclaimer. "But yes, your property is within the overlay zone. It was identified as underutilized based on last year's development survey." "Underutilized," Landon repeated, letting the word settle in the space between them. She avoided his eyes. "That's the term. It means the county believes it could serve a broader function for the public if redeveloped." "And who decides that?" "A zoning review board," she replied. "In consultation with private planning partners." "Private," Landon repeated, this time without hiding the edge in his voice. "I can't speak to those contracts," she answered quickly. "I'm just here to help with property data." He didn't argue. There was no point. The machine had started rolling, and he was simply another form to check off, another file on someone's desk. Back at the farm, Landon walked the perimeter in silence, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots the only sound besides the rustle of wind in the sycamores. He paused by the corner fence, where the old surveyor's post still leaned like a tired soldier. The land hadn't changed. The soil was the same loam, the same stubborn clay and rocky strips that had challenged his grandfather's plow. But the world beyond it had. The town had grown fatter, more networked, more eager to erase its slow, rural sprawl with sleek developments and visitor centers. The state needed more points of access, more connectivity nodes, and Landon's farm sat in their path like a rock they now intended to break. He didn't consider himself radical, nor did he harbor illusions of being a martyr for property rights. But this wasn't about pride. It wasn't even about nostalgia. It was about control, and someone else trying to take it without admitting they were doing so. For a man like Landon, who lived his life reading between the lines, the picture was already clear. This wasn't just a policy shift. It was a strategic encroachment. And encroachment, if left unchecked, never stops at the fence line. What bothered him most was the quiet, the deliberate, rehearsed politeness of it all. No one had come to threaten him directly. There were no angry inspectors, no bribes, no coercion in the traditional sense. Instead, it was the machinery of bureaucracy, subtle and fluid, moving like fog into spaces where resistance was hard to articulate. By the time most people noticed, it was too late. They were already tenants on land they used to own. Landon wasn't about to let that happen. Not quietly, not through loopholes, not without resistance that was intelligent, calculated, and impossible to dismiss as the rantings of some bitter holdout. And so that evening he sat at his worn wooden desk, opened a notebook, and began to write. Not a manifesto, not a journal, but a plan. A measured response. If they were coming for his land, they would discover that some properties, and some men, cannot be quietly erased. 3 weeks after that quiet visit to the county office, Landon received the first official notice. It came folded inside a flat brown envelope with the kind of recycled paper stock that local governments favored, rough in texture, clinical in tone, and entirely devoid of human voice. The letter informed him that his property had been scheduled for an environmental suitability audit under subsection D-4 of the State Land Use Review Code. The stated reason was ambiguous. Concerns of infrastructural non-compliance and potential ecological inconsistencies with surrounding parcels. No clear accusation, no evidence. Just a formal declaration that an interdisciplinary assessment team would need access to his land within the next 30 days. Landon read it twice, not out of confusion but out of growing disbelief. The audit wasn't just unexpected, it was unprompted, and, more importantly, unwarranted. There had been no citations, no complaints, no recorded infractions. Nothing on his property had changed in a way that could have triggered a red flag. The only change had come from outside, from the so-called revitalization efforts now creeping across rural zones like ivy on old stone. This wasn't about the environment. This was about access. They wanted a foothold. The letter was the bureaucratic equivalent of knocking politely before breaking down a door. He didn't waste time with emotion. That wasn't his style. Instead, he called the only attorney he trusted, a slow-speaking but sharp land use specialist named Margaret Fraley, who worked 2 counties over and had handled property easement disputes for decades. He'd hired her once before, years ago, when a telecom company had tried to lay fiber lines under a shared drainage canal that passed within 10 feet of his well system. She'd shut it down before the first stake hit the ground. When she answered his call, she remembered his voice immediately. "This audit," Landon explained, "it's not organic. It's strategic. They want to find something, anything, to build a case." Fraley didn't ask how he knew. She simply replied, "I believe you. Send me the letter, and I'll file a review request with the Environmental Board. It won't stop the inspection, but it'll force them to operate under higher scrutiny." That night, Landon made digital copies of everything. The letter, his tax receipts, his land title, the soil reports from the last 5 years, and every compliance certificate he'd ever filed. He uploaded the documents to an encrypted drive and labeled it simply, "Defense." It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Bureaucracies operated on attrition. They buried people in steps, hoping fatigue or confusion would do what legal force couldn't. But Landon didn't tire easily, and he didn't forget details. He wasn't going to allow a slow-motion land grab to go unchallenged. 3 days later, a pair of SUVs pulled up to the edge of his gravel drive. They didn't come up the path, didn't knock, didn't announce themselves. They simply parked, opened the trunks, and began unloading equipment: drones, water sample kits, clipboards, and tripods. Landon watched through his second-story window. There were 5 of them, all wearing plain outdoor gear. No badges, no county logos, just laminated ID cards clipped to their belts with bold red borders that read, "Contract Surveyor, Development Study Group." They hadn't been sent by the county. These were subcontractors, private firms hired to execute public work under flexible guidelines. It was a loophole that Landon recognized immediately. Government couldn't enter his land without notice or cause, but contractors operating under open audit procedures could assess from perimeters and public vantage points. He stepped outside, calm and composed, walking to the edge of his gate as the team began positioning drones. "You're on private land," he said clearly. "You need to coordinate with the county environmental office if you're conducting an audit." One of the surveyors, a man with thinning hair and a handheld mapping unit, looked up briefly and offered a benign smile. "We're just collecting elevation data," he replied. "We're authorized to fly over any parcel flagged for review." "By whose authority?" "Joint Municipal Consortium. We're under contract, just doing our part." Landon didn't argue. He simply raised his phone and began recording. Not dramatically, not with any shouting or posturing, just a methodical panning of their equipment, vehicles, and ID tags. The man frowned, but said nothing more. Within minutes, the team packed up and left without flying the drones. That evening, Landon called Fraley again. She was already ahead of him. They're testing your reaction. If you get aggressive, you give them ammunition. If you let them do what they want, they file a vague but dangerous preliminary finding. You handled it right, but this is going to escalate. 2 weeks passed without new incidents. Landon repaired fence lines, reinforced camera systems, and kept detailed logs of every visitor, letter, or activity on the property. But then came the second hit, this time from the county zoning committee. It wasn't an inspection notice. It was a proposal. Reclassify his land from residential agricultural to mixed-use development corridor. It was described as voluntary, but the language was laced with threat. Failure to participate in the reclassification process, it stated, might result in limitations on infrastructure assistance and emergency service prioritization. It was veiled coercion, an invitation to cooperate under the unspoken promise that non-compliance would come with invisible consequences. Fraley was livid. This isn't a zoning review. It's soft condemnation. They want to reframe the parcel so it becomes a legal anomaly. Once that happens, your rights get overridden by regional policy updates. It's slow, but effective, and almost impossible to undo once it's finalized. Landon knew she was right, and it explained everything. The sudden environmental audit, the unannounced surveyors, the change in tax language. It was all part of a layered campaign. Create the impression of non-compliance, then offer a way out that looked voluntary but wasn't. Most people folded under that kind of pressure. They agreed to zoning changes, accepted buyout offers, or sold under duress long before realizing what was happening. But Landon didn't scare easily, and he didn't mistake bureaucracy for authority. What he needed now wasn't just defense. He needed leverage. That's when the idea struck, not as an act of rebellion but as a tactic grounded in strategy and legality. His private training range, once a personal hobby, had quietly grown into something more structured over the years. He'd hosted certified instructors, maintained state inspection standards, and documented every activity. All it lacked was formal designation. If he officially reclassified part of the land as a training facility for firearm safety education, he could create a regulatory barrier. Such facilities fell under specific state protections and required a different kind of zoning review, one that couldn't be overridden by municipal planners or consortium boards without federal challenge. He brought the idea to Fraley, who paused before responding. "It's aggressive," she said, "but it's also perfectly legal. You'll be stepping into the open, though. Once you file that reclassification, they'll come after you harder. They'll paint you as obstructionist, as a liability. Maybe worse." Landon didn't hesitate. Let them. That same week, he began assembling the paperwork. It wouldn't be easy. There would be inspections, permits, declarations of operational purpose. But it would transform the narrative. He would no longer be a solitary landowner resisting modernization. He would be the founder of a protected training facility for licensed civilian safety instruction. It wasn't just defense. It was a declaration of purpose. And purpose, unlike resistance, demanded respect. By the time the final paperwork was mailed, Landon felt something shift. Not in the ground beneath his boots, but in the air itself. It was the shift that came when a man stops preparing to hold his ground and starts preparing to reclaim it. The ink had barely dried on the final forms for the firearms training facility when the first blow came. Not from a state office or legal appeal, but from something far more insidious: silence. Not the natural quiet of his land, but a procedural one. A calculated pause from the bureaucratic machine. For nearly 2 weeks there was no mail, no notices, no surveyors on the property perimeter, no calls from the zoning board or environmental council. To someone less experienced, it might have felt like a victory, a retreat. But Landon knew better. Bureaucracies don't disappear. They recoil before they strike. That silence was broken not by the sound of an engine or a knock on his door, but by the crunch of tires on the lower gravel drive just after 6 in the morning. The vehicle didn't stop at his gate. It didn't wait for permission. It rolled through with quiet entitlement and parked beside the barn. He was already outside by then, coffee in hand, waiting from the moment motion alerts buzzed on his phone. He recognized the seal before the man inside even stepped out. A county inspector's badge, silver on navy. But it wasn't an environmental officer or a zoning liaison. This time it was someone from the Department of Public Safety. The man was dressed casually, as if to disarm suspicion, but his eyes swept the property with the efficiency of someone trained to assess rather than observe. His tone was cordial, almost apologetic. "We received an anonymous tip regarding the storage of hazardous materials on the premises," he said without a trace of irony. "Protocol requires an on-site inspection to confirm or dismiss the claim. Nothing invasive." Landon didn't blink. "Anonymous, huh?" The man smiled as if embarrassed. "It happens more than you'd think." He was polite, asked for consent to walk through the outbuildings, made notes on his phone, and refrained from making any accusations. But when he passed the range area, clearly marked with laminated safety procedures posted on both fences, he paused for a beat too long. Landon knew that pause. It wasn't curiosity, it was inventory. The man was assessing not the layout but the potential optics. What it would look like if this property became a headline. How easy it would be to paint the wrong picture. When he left, he thanked Landon for his cooperation and said there'd be no further action at this time. That phrase echoed as the truck pulled away. It wasn't closure, it was warning. By the next week, it was clear the inspection had triggered something deeper. He noticed new tire tracks near the utility trail behind the tree line, tracks that didn't belong to any of his equipment or the 2 neighboring parcels. At first, he assumed it was hikers or maybe teenagers with an ATV, but then he found the first marker, a white painted stake with a coded serial number driven into the earth a foot from one of his drainage basins. Not a surveyor's stake, an infrastructure tag, the kind utilities used for mapping buried services, the kind used to establish future readiness. He didn't touch it. He photographed it, logged the coordinates, and sent the file to Fraley. Within an hour, she replied, "That's an anchor tag. Someone's mapping possible service expansion. They're laying groundwork for utilities that haven't even been approved yet." This wasn't a wait-and-see operation anymore. Someone had already decided that Landon's land was no longer his. The mechanisms were moving forward without his consent, without a hearing, without a vote. And now, with the reclassification of his range pending state verification, they were racing against the clock. Still, Landon stayed quiet. He didn't give them a soundbite. He didn't post online or call in local news. He played his hand slowly, methodically. He increased the frequency of range activities, logged every session, updated his safety protocols weekly, and ensured that all ammunition usage, handling procedures, and access logs were airtight. If they were going to try and discredit him, they'd have nothing to work with but fabrications, and he intended to make them work very hard if they wanted to make something up. Then came the complaint. Filed by a neighbor he barely knew, one of the newer families who had bought into a renovated farmhouse 3 miles north. It alleged that loud, irregular gunfire from Landon's range disrupted their peaceful enjoyment of the countryside and suggested possible danger to nearby hikers. The wording was textbook. Not emotionally charged, but legally weighted. It was designed to trigger a review of his facility's operational legitimacy. It worked. A letter arrived from the Regional Planning Committee citing noise irregularities and potential public safety conflict, and announcing a review hearing to determine whether the range should be subject to new local ordinances on firearms discharge zones. The kicker, the committee hadn't previously had the authority to regulate such zones, But thanks to an emergency proposal introduced by a council member 2 weeks prior, coincidentally just after Landon's reclassification filing, they now had temporary jurisdiction. He forwarded the notice to Fraley, who responded less like a lawyer and more like someone watching a chess game become a knife fight. "They're improvising," she said, "and they're sloppy, but they've also got momentum." The hearing was scheduled for 30 days out. That gave Landon time, but not luxury. He needed to solidify the range's protected status through the state office before the local ordinance could take hold. If the state designation went through first, it would override any municipal interference. But if the local ruling came first, it could trigger an injunction, one that could tie up the property in hearings for months or even years. Time wasn't just pressure now, it was a weapon. In the meantime, the provocations continued. Trail cameras he'd installed years ago, long forgotten, set to low-resolution time-lapse for monitoring wildlife, began turning up strange footage. People walking just inside his eastern boundary at night. Not vandals, not kids. Adults, dressed in dark, utility-style clothing. They didn't carry flashlights, and they didn't linger. But they passed by his fence line at consistent times, once every 3 days, always between 2 and 4 a.m. He upgraded the cameras to live feeds, silently linked to his encrypted network. He didn't broadcast what he saw. He didn't act immediately. He just watched. And then, on a cold Thursday morning, one of his fuel tanks was found open. Not vandalized, no cuts, no smashed locks. Just unscrewed, with a thin chemical scent clinging to the cap. He ran a quick test and found trace contamination, not enough to disable his generator or systems, but enough to hint that someone was sending a message. "We can reach you." He didn't call the sheriff. He didn't want to hand them the narrative that this was some escalating survivalist standoff. Instead, he brought in a private security consultant, an off-grid systems analyst from out of state. They did a full sweep, found no bugs, no backdoor camera leaks, no evidence of hacking. But the consultant confirmed one thing. The perimeter had been breached multiple times in recent days by foot, likely by someone with prior knowledge of the terrain. When Landon asked if it was worth installing active deterrence, the consultant shook his head. Number. They're not trying to steal. They're testing your response. If you overreact, they call you unstable. If you do nothing, they escalate. This is a probing strategy. And so, Landon did the only thing they wouldn't expect. He made his operation more public. He filed formal training events with the state registry, announced seminars on firearms safety, published attendance logs, and began inviting certified instructors from the Tri-County area to teach. Not as an act of defiance, but as a demonstration. This wasn't a fringe operation. It was a facility, and it served the public good. And behind every form, every log, every procedure, one message began to take shape. Not in words, but in structure. You picked the wrong man, and you're running out of ways to bury him. The shift came quietly, like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. Landon didn't notice it in a headline or a knock on the door, but in the cadence of conversations, in the way the clerk at the hardware store no longer asked about his well pump, and in how the neighbors who once nodded politely now averted their eyes. When passing his driveway, he had become a name in their whispers, a subject in cautious phrases exchanged over grocery counters and at community meetings where his presence wasn't needed to define the mood. Not because he had done anything overtly wrong, he hadn't, but because the gears of local influence had begun turning with intent, and his refusal to submit had branded him disruptive. But disruption wasn't his goal. Landon was not trying to spark rebellion or ignite headlines. His intent had always been measured: preserve, protect, operate within the limits of law. Yet, as the noise grew louder and the accusations more opaque, it became clear that the fight had evolved beyond his property line. This was no longer just about land. It was about image, about narrative, about who controlled the language that shaped the future of their county. The state's response to his training range classification was slower than expected. Bureaucratic reviews dragged behind layers of interagency verification. He called Fraley twice a week, never to complain, only to remain informed. She was doing everything within procedural limits, but she wasn't naive. "They're stalling you," she said plainly one afternoon. "They know if they hold up approval for another 6 weeks, the local board can vote on provisional regulation, and you'll be subject to retroactive ordinance claims. You'll have to either shut down or enter arbitration. Either way, they win time, and your money bleeds while they maneuver." Landon asked what could be done. She said, "Use what you've got." And what he had wasn't lawyers or leverage. It was records, timelines, footage, permits, data. Boring to most, but meticulous. And among those files was a 3-week series of reports tied to unregistered activity near his boundary lines, including the ID tags of the first drone survey team and timestamps from his environmental monitors. He'd logged everything, including the pattern of foot traffic that traced a narrow arc behind the forested rise at the northern edge of his land, an area previously inaccessible by vehicle, now showing signs of ground disturbance consistent with light. Construction preparation. He suspected a fiber or water conduit was being routed illegally through the conservation edge, a theory he didn't need to prove, only document. Instead of calling enforcement, he requested a certified third-party inspection from a civil planning liaison in the neighboring county, someone not yet caught in the local political web. The inspector, middle-aged and professional, made a day trip without notifying local offices. She arrived in a personal vehicle, stayed for 2 hours, took soil samples, flagged inconsistencies in elevation marks, and found that the markers on the disputed strip were not only unlicensed, but registered to a defunct municipal contractor who hadn't operated in the area for over a year. Her report, filed discreetly and shared with Fraley, triggered a preliminary ethics review by a state compliance oversight board. It was a pin dropped in a pile of needles, barely noticed at first. But within days, Landon's name appeared in the inboxes of 3 regional development agencies with the subject line, "Request for Coordination." Not an accusation, not a warning, a signal. He had become a variable. Around this same time, a man named Whitlow arrived. He was not a councilman or an inspector. He didn't introduce himself as part of any authority, nor did he imply legal pressure. He wore a tailored shirt, drove a rental SUV with no visible credentials, and carried himself with the calm detachment of someone accustomed to being heard. He asked if Landon had a few minutes. Landon obliged. They stood near the barn, wind cutting gently through the open field, the sky clouded but dry. "I represent a group of investors," Whitlow began, "interested in the long-term transformation of this region. You're in a key location. The range, the autonomy, the stance you've taken, it's impressive, and it's not lost on us that you're a formidable obstacle." Landon didn't respond. Whitlow continued, "We don't want to fight you. We'd rather incorporate you." He explained with the practiced ease of a man used to skeptical landowners that his backers wanted to propose a collaborative reintegration of Landon's parcel. The training range could remain operational, he said, under joint oversight. They'd fund improvements, offer licensing support, even retain Landon as a consultant. In return, he'd relinquish land rights for infrastructure corridors, wide enough for pedestrian traffic, survey access, and emergency vehicles. "It wouldn't affect your house," Whitlow assured. "You'd retain core acreage. We just need flow." Landon didn't decline immediately. He listened, took notes, asked who exactly these investors were. Whitlow dodged specifics but hinted at international green development funds, federal partnerships, and pilot programs aimed at eco-resilience and rural innovation. It all sounded vaguely altruistic, studded with enough jargon to imply inevitability. When the meeting ended, Landon thanked him politely, walked back inside, and locked the door behind him. Then he typed a summary of the encounter, saved it alongside his inspection records, and added a new folder titled Infiltration. The offer was validation. He knew now with certainty that they weren't simply pressuring him for compliance. They wanted control. They wanted a foothold, not just on his land, but over his narrative. They wanted to turn a man defending his right to live without interference into a participant in their experiment. It wasn't malice. It was method. And so, Landon made his next move. He opened the range, officially, publicly. He invited instructors with real credentials, issued invitations through legal channels, filed every activity with the state registry, and hosted structured safety seminars, 2 a week, by appointment only. No grandstanding, no flyers or social media, just quiet, orderly professionalism. He kept logs, collected waivers, and offered free courses to any certified safety officer in the surrounding 3 counties. It wasn't just about optics. It was about foundation. He wasn't running a defiant backyard range. He was operating a formalized, state-recognized safety and training center with attendance logs and compliance documentation that could survive any audit. And it worked. The public complaints, once steady, began to waver. Some accusations were proven false by time-stamped records. Others were disproved by the very officers whom Landon welcomed for inspection. It wasn't a landslide. It wasn't a victory. But it was the first sign that he had changed the nature of the battlefield. He wasn't just defending anymore. He was building. And what he was building was hard to dismantle. By the time early spring washed the frost from the fields, Landon could feel it. Not the thaw in the air, but the pivot. The battle was no longer about dislodging him quietly or baiting him into a legal misstep. That phase had failed. They had underestimated his discipline, his patience, and most of all, his ability to adapt without compromising the integrity of what he'd built. What came next was retaliation. Not loud, not clumsy, but woven through daily functions and procedural detours, subtle enough that an outsider might not notice, but relentless in its cumulative pressure. It began with the range's mail, permits delayed, renewal notifications mysteriously missing, packages from certified instructors rerouted or returned to sender. Landon initially chalked it up to clerical error, perhaps an overworked postal system, until one instructor forwarded him a scan of a handwritten note taped to a returned parcel. No such recipient at listed address, it read. Landon stared at it for a full minute before exhaling slowly. The address on the parcel was correct. The stamp date matched his own tracking. Someone had intervened. It was petty, but effective. Fraley filed a complaint on his behalf through the state's Small Business Oversight Channel, but the response was indifferent. Mail discrepancies are not considered regulatory obstruction unless demonstrable and repeated, the letter said, almost mockingly. Landon knew proving interference in that lane would be an uphill grind, traceable only if someone slipped badly. So he shifted strategy. He rented a secure P.O. box in the next county over, under the name of the training facility, and had all correspondence redirected. He didn't argue with the broken system. He bypassed it. That workaround held for a time. But the next front opened soon after. A new county ordinance, titled innocuously as the Community Safety Buffer Initiative, proposed to introduce conditional zoning for parcels operating what the committee described as potentially hazardous educational functions. The language was just vague enough to apply to gun ranges, chemical labs, even some agricultural facilities that used fuel-based equipment. What made it dangerous was the enforcement clause. Any parcel within 300 feet of another residential zone would be subject to mandatory conditional use hearings every fiscal quarter. Landon's range was 320 feet from the nearest structure, but that didn't matter. Not after the committee introduced a motion to adjust residential boundaries by redefining parcel classification lines. If approved, The change would push one of the newer homes into the buffer zone, triggering the regulation. And just like that, without moving a single stone, Landon's facility would fall under quarterly scrutiny by an openly hostile local board. He read the proposed ordinance 3 times. The cleverness of it was in its minimalism. It didn't attack him directly. It didn't name him. It simply reconfigured the board game and changed the square he was standing on. He didn't attend the public hearing. Instead, he sent Fraley with notarized objections, maps, and affidavits from his instructors testifying to the range's compliance history, safety records, and community contributions. She delivered the presentation calmly and concisely, and then, as expected, the board voted the ordinance forward, 4-3. That night, Landon sat at his desk under the dim hum of the kitchen bulb and began cross-referencing the ordinance sponsors with the development board members who had tried to contact him through Whitlow. One name overlapped, a woman named Darlene Kramer, who served as a consulting liaison for the County Planning Commission and had quietly accepted a position on a nonprofit tied to regional infrastructure investment. The nonprofit's filing address was linked to a P.O. box in the same city Whitlow's associates had listed as their headquarters. The chain wasn't airtight, but it was enough to signal that decisions weren't being made in isolation. He didn't go public. He didn't leak the connection. He saved the data and sent it to Fraley with a note. "Keep this in case they try to bury me in regulation." While that fight brewed, the provocations on his property resumed. Trail cameras began picking up motion again, pairs of figures moving just inside the tree line, this time wearing reflective vests marked with survey crew. When Landon approached them, they refused to identify a supervisor. "We're pre-approval contractors," one said, "not authorized to give interviews." They left behind orange survey ribbons and a geotagged flag pinned into the base of an old cedar tree. When Landon examined the tag, he saw a QR code that, when scanned, opened a private mapping application linked to a regional planning firm he'd never heard of. He filed a trespass report, but the sheriff's office responded with a non-committal shrug. "You've got training activity here," the deputy said. "Probably just some confusion with public access. Happens all the time." Landon didn't press the issue. Instead, he rerouted his security system to isolate every new perimeter breach, logged the timestamps, and invested in a private monitoring agency out of state, one specializing in rural asset protection. They didn't send guards. They sent data. Within 3 weeks, Landon had a full dossier. Each breach, each vehicle used, license plate captures, times, durations, and even indirect links between one of the survey contractors and a lobbying group that had been aggressively funding the zoning ordinance push. The harassment escalated. One morning, Landon found a flyer taped to his mailbox, printed professionally, designed like a PSA. It warned of paramilitary training activity in the region and urged residents to report unauthorized gunfire and protect our families. It didn't mention him by name, but the address listed for community concern led to a proxy website with a dot marking the approximate location of his range. He scanned the QR code, traced the domain registration, and found it hosted on a server out of Illinois, registered 2 weeks prior under a shell company with no listed owner. He brought the flyer to the sheriff's office. They looked at it, nodded, and filed it. Nothing more. No investigation, no concern. Just another piece of paper in a folder labeled Miscellaneous Community Reports. But Landon didn't need them to act. He needed them to not interfere when the blowback came, because he was preparing one of his own. Over the following month, he built a public file, nothing inflammatory, nothing emotional, just data. He compiled a timeline of every incident, ordinance, breach, delay, and procedural irregularity. He backed it with scanned documents, photographs, names, and dates. He included audio clips, video logs, even excerpts from council meetings. He posted none of it online. Instead, he sent it, quietly and without fanfare, to a federal oversight committee on rural land interference and regulatory overreach, an entity rarely invoked, often underutilized, but still operational. Fraley helped with the legal framing. She didn't expect a response. That wasn't the point. The point was traceability. The point was to place the record where it couldn't be deleted. Simultaneously, he requested a compliance audit on the very board that had passed the conditional zoning. The trigger: a procedural conflict between their application of retroactive enforcement and the county charter's restrictions on backdated ordinances. It was a legal technicality, but a real one, and it forced the board to freeze their action pending review. It wasn't a victory, but it was a disruption. And in that disruption, Landon made his most decisive move yet. He purchased the adjacent 10-acre strip of land, once fallow, now up for sale due to unpaid taxes from a deceased owner's estate. It wasn't much, but it expanded his buffer zone. With that purchase, he not only reset the residential proximity issue, but triggered a new review period for his facility's classification, effectively blocking the ordinance's quarterly review clause from taking effect. The purchase was legal, documented, and fully funded. The zoning board couldn't challenge it without exposing their own procedural inconsistencies. They didn't send more surveyors after that. They sent lawyers. A notice arrived by courier. No sheriff, no deputy, just a man in a business suit who handed over a heavy envelope and walked away without a word. Inside was a cease and desist claim, arguing that Landon's range activities posed a credible and present threat to adjacent communities, based on unverified reports of tactical training involving non-civilian equipment. It was unsigned, and the Meshuswar legal firm listed didn't appear in any local directory. When Fraley reviewed it, she frowned. "This isn't about winning in court," she said. "It's about freezing you. They want to drag you into depositions, discovery, delay your operations, and make you burn money." He didn't respond to the letter. He filed a countersuit, preemptively, under abuse of process. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was retaliating with structure, with rules, with patience and paper and protocol. Every attack made him sharper. Every maneuver they attempted gave him a new counterweight. They had tried to drain him slowly. Now they were bleeding their own time, and Landon, against everything they'd assumed, was still standing. The sky that morning was a hard, metallic gray, the kind that promised neither rain nor relief, only the weight of pressure waiting to drop. Landon sat on the edge of his porch with a coffee that had long since gone cold, boots planted firm on the steps, his eyes fixed on the road beyond the tree line where no traffic passed but all things seemed to start. Today wasn't about preservation. It wasn't about filing paperwork or holding a line. Today was about confrontation, though not of the kind most people imagined. There would be no shouting, no dramatic standoff in the dirt. The war, as it had always been, was administrative, structured, legal, disguised in civility and carried out in conference rooms. But today it would break through the veneer and expose what had been grinding beneath it all along. The county board hearing wasn't being held in the usual annex. That building had been mysteriously scheduled for maintenance. Instead, the meeting had been moved to a community center 2 towns over, as if quietly hoping to discourage attendance. The agenda listed standard zoning discussions, permit renewals, and public review of non-conforming land use under petitioned conflict. That last item was Landon's. They wouldn't name him directly on the docket, but everyone knew. The facility had become a symbol of resistance, of refusal, of the one man who wouldn't sell, wouldn't compromise, wouldn't let the machinery of quiet acquisition grind him down. Fraley met him in the parking lot, her hair pulled back, expression set like stone. She didn't waste time on greetings. "They're here," she said, handing him a folder. 3 board members, 2 of the external planners, 1 of the investor liaisons pretending to be a resident, and legal reps from that unregistered firm. All of them came early. They've got statements. They're trying to frame you as a liability." Landon didn't ask for details. He simply nodded and took the folder, scanning the bullet points she'd prepared. There was nothing dramatic, no theatrics, just facts. Policy contradictions, ordinance irregularities, recorded instances of selective enforcement. It wasn't an argument built to stir emotion. It was designed to hold up under scrutiny, no matter who tried to pick it apart. The meeting hall was brightly lit and too quiet. Rows of plastic chairs lined the floor, sparsely filled with residents. Some curious, some weary, some silently hoping the whole ordeal would resolve itself so they wouldn't have to pick a side. At the front sat the board, postured behind a long table draped with a neutral-colored cloth, faces blank with procedural fatigue. A man Landon recognized, Councilman Arthur Bryn, sat in the center, hands folded. He nodded slightly as Landon entered, not in welcome, but in acknowledgement. The session opened with routine drudgery, building codes, minor petitions. And then Bryn's voice shifted tone, subtle but formal. Item 9. Petition to address conflict between conditional use enforcement and active operations under pending state jurisdiction. Registered stakeholder, Landon Burrows. Landon stood slowly, Fraley beside him. No fanfare. No clearing of the throat. She handed out printed briefs to each board member without comment, then took her place just behind Landon as he stepped forward. His voice, when he spoke, was even, calm. The same tone he'd used to explain a maintenance protocol or cite a safety stat from memory. For over 2 years, this facility has operated under strict state compliance, he began. We've maintained training logs, followed noise regulations, filed all permits on time, and passed every inspection. Despite this, the property has been subject to irregular reclassification efforts, unlawful surveying, and attempts at retroactive enforcement based on unsubstantiated complaints. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He let the silence hang between each statement heavy and unavoidable. I'm not here to protest development. I'm here because your methods haven't been transparent, and because the actions taken against my property aren't part of a zoning issue. They're part of a campaign, one that began with drone flights, evolved into procedural sabotage, and has now escalated into legal harassment backed by unverifiable claims and untraceable firms. Bryn didn't react. None of them did. But one of the investor liaisons, the same man who'd once tried to meet him under a false pretense of partnership, spoke up. Mr. Burrows, with respect, the board isn't responsible for independent legal actions taken by private actors. Landon turned to face him, measured. They weren't independent when your firm submitted zoning modification proposals 3 weeks after those actions began. They weren't independent when your name appeared on the consulting roster for the Infrastructure Realignment Committee that used those same surveys to propose changes that bypassed charter restrictions. Fraley stepped forward then, calm but sharp. And, just to clarify, we've submitted copies of those links to the Office of State Compliance, which has opened a preliminary review into the ordinance procedures applied to Mr. Burrows' parcel. Until that review concludes, any local actions taken against the facility could constitute obstruction. The room shifted, slight but real. What followed wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, it was slow unraveling. The board, cornered but not ready to surrender, pivoted to delay. We'll table further enforcement actions until legal clarification is obtained, Bryn announced, pending state response. It wasn't a win, but it was something better, a freeze. A pause in which their momentum died and his structure held. Outside the center, Fraley lit a cigarette with shaking hands. You know this isn't the end, she said without looking at him. They'll regroup. Landon stared out at the tree line in the distance. Good, he said. So will I. What he didn't say was that he'd already begun. That while they focused on the legal assault, he'd been building something they hadn't accounted for. Alliances, other property owners, other instructors, people quietly watching to see if the system could be resisted without descending into chaos. People who were tired of selling, tired of giving ground. He had no intention of becoming a leader, but he was, now, a precedent. And that, more than anything, was something they couldn't unmake. The frost returned late that year, creeping over the edges of the fencing posts like a warning from the earth itself. Quiet, undeniable, and patient. Landon stood by the perimeter at dawn, watching steam rise from the damp field as the temperature dropped below freezing. The range was empty today, by design. No trainees, no instructors, no sound but the wind curling through the branches. The stillness wasn't defeat. It was choice. A pause earned, not imposed. The state's compliance board ruling had arrived earlier in the week. It didn't come with headlines or press conferences, only a packet mailed to Fraley's office with the dry, weighty tone of a government language doing its best to sound impartial. It acknowledged procedural inconsistencies in the county's ordinance process, citing conflict of interest, failure to notify property stakeholders, and disproportionate enforcement against a singular operator. It didn't call it targeted harassment, but it didn't need to. The implications were enough. The result: all local enforcement actions were suspended pending full charter review, and the zoning classification of Landon's facility was to remain in place, uncontested, until the next legislative cycle, 12 months minimum. It wasn't a victory they would celebrate in public, but it was final, at least for now. A forced armistice. 1 year of clear air. Fraley had simply said, "You held." She didn't say he'd won, and she didn't have to, because Landon understood something most people didn't. You never really win against the machine. You just survive long enough that it starts looking elsewhere. The neighbor who once filed a complaint had since moved, sold the place quietly to a company that hadn't listed its purpose. Landon kept tabs on it, but the house remained empty. Overgrown grass. No signs of renovation. It didn't sit right with him, but for now it posed no immediate threat. He'd learned that not every attack comes loud or sudden. Some just wait. He hadn't reopened the range fully yet. Instead, he limited sessions to 1 a week, with small groups, all by invitation. Not out of fear, but out of intent. He wanted to recalibrate, focus on precision, purpose, endurance. It wasn't about making noise anymore. It was about maintaining something unshakable. A rhythm, a foundation, a place that didn't flinch when tested. People noticed, quietly, without asking. Other landowners called, not to gossip, but to ask what forms he used, how he logged his audits, what laws had protected him. Some didn't say anything at all, just sent messages through Fraley or mutual acquaintances. "He didn't bend," they'd say. "Maybe we don't have to either." He had never asked to be an example. He didn't want to be, but that wasn't his decision to make anymore. One afternoon, a young man arrived at the gate, mid-20s, clean-cut, anxious but respectful. He introduced himself as the grandson of a property owner 2 counties over who was being pressured into a land reclassification. "My grandfather's tired," the young man said. "They want him to sign, just to make things easier. I heard about what you did here. He won't go public, but he needs a plan." Landon didn't offer speeches. He walked the man through his documentation, showed him how to archive records, how to request inspections, how to use their own protocols against them. He didn't charge. He didn't take credit. When the man left 2 hours later, he left with a folder, a list of deadlines, and a very different look in his eyes. That was what remained. Not glory, not revenge, just function. Proof that resistance didn't require a scream, only consistency, patience, and an absolute refusal to let systems swallow you whole. The wind that night was sharp, but not cruel. Landon stood at the range again, watching the horizon. The targets were still lined in perfect symmetry, untouched. The kind of quiet he preferred. Not the silence of surrender, but of readiness. He knew they might come again. In a different form, with different tactics. A new boy